At my husband's funeral, no one came except me. But my son said, "Finally, now all the inheritance is mine." I said nothing. The next day, when the lawyer opened the will, his face went pale. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellen Harlow, and I am 71 years old. I say that not to ask for sympathy. Lord knows I've never been one for that. But because it matters. Because at 71, you think the storms of your life are mostly behind you. You think you've already fought the hardest battles. You think the people who share your blood could not possibly be the ones who would try to take everything from you. I was wrong. Tom and I had been married for 46 years. 46 years of Saturday morning coffee on the back porch of our house in Millbrook, Ohio. 46 years of arguments over the thermostat and whose turn it was to call the plumber. 46 years of the kind of love that doesn't look like anything in the movies. No grand gestures, no breathless speeches, just a man who always made sure my car had gas in the tank and remembered that I hated cilantro. Simple things, real things. We had one son, Derek. Derek was 52 years old, tall like his father, and handsome in a way that had always served him better than his character deserved. He lived 40 minutes away in Columbus with his wife, Sandra, a woman who smiled with her mouth and watched with her eyes. They had no children, which Derek always blamed on Sandra, and Sandra always blamed on timing, and I had long since stopped asking. For most of his adult life, Derek had been distant in the way that some sons are. Not cruel, not absent, but never quite present either. Birthdays acknowledged with a phone call, holidays attended with visible impatience, conversations steered away from anything personal. Tom accepted it quietly. I accepted it less quietly, but accepted it nonetheless. That was our family. Functional, if not warm. But in the last 2 years of Tom's life, something shifted. Tom had been diagnosed with a slow-progressing heart condition at 68. Nothing immediately fatal, the doctors said, but something to manage carefully. He was on medication, attended regular appointments, and had been told plainly that his heart was aging faster than the rest of him. We adjusted. We slowed down. We spent more evenings at home and fewer on long drives through the countryside. It was a new chapter, quieter than the others, but we were still reading it together. That was when Derek began calling more often. At first I told myself I was being uncharitable. A son hearing about his father's heart condition and wanting to reconnect. What was wrong with that? I pushed the unease down and tried to be grateful. Tom was pleased by the attention. He and Derek would sit on the porch and talk for hours, and Tom would come inside afterward looking lighter than he had in years. But I watched. I had always been a watcher. I noticed that Derek's questions during those visits tilted in a particular direction. How was the house holding up? Had we thought about whether it was too big for just the two of us? What were Tom's plans for the retirement accounts? Had we spoken to a financial advisor recently? Was Tom still using the same attorney he'd used for years, old Gerald Pace? Or had he considered someone more current? Each question, on its own, could have been innocent. Together, they formed a pattern I recognized the way you recognize a smell. Not consciously at first, then all at once, with certainty. I mentioned it to Tom once, carefully. He waved it off. He's just growing up, Maggie. Better late than never. Tom always wanted to believe the best of Derek. I think it was the one place where his judgment was simply not available to him. Tom died on a Thursday morning in October. A cardiac event, the doctors called it. Sudden and, they assured me, painless. He was in his armchair by the window with his coffee cup still in his hand, and the morning light was coming through the curtains the way he always liked it. If there is a merciful way to lose someone, I suppose that was it. It didn't feel merciful. It felt like the floor had been pulled out from under everything. The funeral was held 4 days later at Millbrook Lutheran, where Tom and I had been married. I had not expected a large crowd. Tom had been a private man, and most of our closest friends were elderly themselves. Some had moved away, some were unwell, one had died just the previous spring. I understood that. I had made peace with it. What I had not made peace with was Derek. He arrived late with Sandra, both of them in expensive dark coats that looked like they had been purchased for the occasion. He sat beside me in the front pew, and when the service ended and we stood in the cemetery in the gray October cold while Tom was lowered into the ground, I looked around and counted. Myself, Derek, Sandra, the pastor, and the two men from the funeral home. That was everyone. I stood at that graveside and said goodbye to the man I had spent 46 years loving, and I was nearly alone. The loneliness of it was a physical thing, heavy across my shoulders, pressing behind my eyes. I didn't cry. I had cried in private every night that week. I had nothing left to show. On the drive back to the house, Derek sat in the back seat with Sandra. I sat in the front passenger seat of my own car while Sandra's sister drove. No one spoke for several minutes. Then Derek said it. His voice was casual, almost cheerful, the tone of someone who had been waiting to say something and had finally found the moment. "Well," he said, "I suppose that's the end of an era. At least now we can start getting things sorted out properly." He paused, then added, "The estate, I mean. Finally. Finally." I looked out the window at the flat Ohio fields going gray under the November sky, and I did not say a single word. But something inside me went very quiet and very still, the way things go quiet just before a decision is made. I had buried my husband 4 hours ago, and my son had said finally. I filed that word away in the place where I keep things I don't intend to forget. The house felt wrong when I walked back into it that afternoon. Not because anything had changed. The furniture was exactly where it had always been. Tom's reading glasses still folded on the side table next to his armchair, his coffee mug washed and drying on the rack by the sink, the way I had left it that morning, out of pure habit. Everything was in its place. That was the problem. The house was the same and Tom was not in it, and the combination of those two facts was almost more than I could hold. Sandra made tea without asking, which I found irritating and said nothing about. Derek moved through the rooms with the particular energy of a man assessing rather than grieving, opening the glass cabinet in the study on the pretext of looking for something to drink, glancing at the bookshelves, standing in the doorway of Tom's home office just a beat longer than was natural. I watched him from the hallway. He didn't know I was watching. He never seemed to consider that I might be. They stayed for 2 hours. Derek ate most of the food that the neighbors had left, talked about logistics, the will, the accounts, the house, with the brisk confidence of a man who believed the answers were already written in his favor. Sandra contributed occasional murmurs of agreement and one practiced look of sympathy in my direction that landed nowhere near her eyes. When they finally left, I stood at the front window and watched their car pull out of the driveway. Then I sat down in Tom's armchair, the first time I had sat there since he died, and I let myself think. What did I actually know? I knew that Tom had made a will. We had both made wills years ago, standard documents drawn up by Gerald Pace, our family attorney, who had handled everything from our house purchase to a minor boundary dispute with a neighbor in 1987. The original wills were simple. Everything to the surviving spouse, and upon the death of the second spouse, the estate divided equally between Derek and any charitable bequests Tom specified. What I did not know, what Tom had not told me until 3 weeks before he died, sitting at the kitchen table on a quiet Sunday afternoon with his hands folded and his expression more serious than usual, was that he had updated his will 8 months earlier. Quietly, without telling Derek, without making a scene. He had gone to Gerald Pace alone on a Tuesday morning and he had made changes. He told me the broad outline. not every detail. Tom had always been a man who believed in the power of information kept close. But enough. Enough for me to know that what Derek believed he was going to receive and what he was actually going to receive were not the same thing. "I've been watching him too," Tom said that Sunday. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said most important things. "I'm not blind, Maggie. I just didn't want to fight about it while I'm still here. Let Gerald handle it after. I had wanted to ask more. I had wanted to know every specific, every number, every clause. But Tom had put his hand over mine and said, 'Trust me, I've taken care of you. That's what matters.' And I had let it go because, after 46 years, I knew which battles were mine to fight and which ones he needed to handle in his own way. Now, sitting in his armchair in the empty house, I understood why he had told me even that much. He had wanted me to be prepared. He had wanted me to know that the ground was not as simple as Derek thought it was. He had given me that much as a weapon, even if he hadn't handed it to me loaded. The question was what I was going to do with it. Fear was present. I won't pretend otherwise. I was a 71-year-old widow, still raw with grief, and my son had sat in the back seat of my car the day of his father's funeral and said finally, with the ease of a man who had been waiting a long time. That kind of cold calculation from someone you raised, someone whose skinned knees you cleaned and whose nightmares you sat through. There is a particular quality of loneliness to that fear. It doesn't just frighten you, it hollows you out. But fear, I have found, is only dangerous when it makes you passive. I gave myself that evening to grieve. I sat in Tom's armchair and I cried until I had nothing left. And then I made myself a proper dinner instead of picking at the food the neighbors had left, because Tom always said you can't think straight when you haven't eaten. I washed the dishes. I called my neighbor Ruth, who had known me for 30 years, and I told her simply that it had been a very hard day. I did not tell her about Derek. Not yet. Then I went to Tom's desk. Tom had kept a leather-bound folder in the bottom right drawer. He called it the "If Something Happens" folder, the document every responsible person should have, but most people put off assembling. Inside was a list. Every account, every asset, every policy, every contact number, the deed to the house, the details of his life insurance, the account numbers for the savings and the brokerage. And at the top of the first page, in Tom's careful handwriting, Gerald Pace, attorney. Call him first, him. I read through the folder twice. Then I picked up my phone and I looked at the clock. 7:45 in the evening. Too late to call Gerald's office, but not too late to send an email. Gerald had given me his direct email years ago for exactly this kind of situation. I wrote him a brief note. Tom had passed. I needed to meet with him as soon as possible. I needed to understand the current will fully before anyone else was informed of its contents. I pressed send. Then I did something I had not done in weeks. I made myself a cup of the good chamomile tea, the kind Tom always complained smelled like a garden shop, and I sat back down in his armchair, and I let myself feel, for just a moment, something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. Tom had told me he had taken care of me. I intended to find out exactly what that meant, and I intended to do it before Derek got anywhere near Gerald Pace's office. Gerald Pace had been a practicing attorney in Millbrook for over 40 years, which meant he had the kind of face that had long since stopped registering surprise. When I came into his office the morning after Tom's funeral, early, before his first official appointment, because he had called me at 8 and said to come right over, He stood up from behind his desk and came around to take both my hands, and the expression on his face was the first genuinely human one I had seen in days. "Maggie," he said, "I'm very sorry about Tom. He was a good man." "He was the best man I knew," I said, and sat down. Gerald's office hadn't changed much in the decades I'd been coming to it. Same dark wood paneling, same framed diplomas behind the desk, same slightly overfull bookshelves with the occasional personal photograph tucked between the law volumes. A picture of Gerald's late wife, a photo from some fishing trip, Tom standing next to Gerald with a laughably small catch and a very satisfied expression. I made myself look away from that one. Gerald sat down and folded his hands on the desk. "I assume you want to go through the full document," he said. "Every word," I said. He walked me through it carefully, clause by clause, with the patient professionalism of a man who understood that the people in this chair needed clarity above all else. And as he talked, I felt the pieces settle into place the way they do when you finally understand something that has been obscured for a long time. Tom had been thorough, more thorough than I had realized. The house was mine outright. The joint savings accounts and Tom's individual accounts had been restructured with me as sole beneficiary 18 months ago. A quiet administrative step that predated even the will revision. The brokerage account, which was the most substantial portion of Tom's investments, was also mine. Tom had designated a percentage to 3 charities he had supported for years. And Derek? Tom had left Derek a sum of money. Not nothing, not a deliberate insult, but a fixed amount, modest relative to the estate's total value. Enough to be called a bequest, not enough to be called a fortune. Accompanied by a letter, which Gerald had been instructed to read aloud at the time of the will's presentation, explaining Tom's reasoning in terms that were measured, factual, and impossible to misread. Tom had written that he loved his son. He had also written that over the past several years he had observed a pattern of behavior from Derek, a pattern of calculation, financial probing, and what Tom called a persistent interest in inheritance rather than relationship, that had led him to make the decision he made. He wrote that he trusted his wife of 46 years completely, and that the estate was placed in her hands because she had earned that trust every single day. Gerald finished reading and looked at me over his glasses. I sat very still for a moment. "He wrote that himself?" I asked. "Every word," Gerald said. "He came in alone. He drafted it across 2 sessions. He was very certain." I pressed my hands flat on my knees to stop them from trembling. Not from distress. From something more complicated than that. From the weight of being known that completely by another person. From grief and gratitude arriving at exactly the same moment. "Does Derek know any of this?" I asked. "He knows a will exists," Gerald said carefully. "As a named beneficiary, he's entitled to be present at the reading, but I have told no one the contents, not until you and I had spoken." I nodded. "When is the reading scheduled?" "I've been trying to reach Derek to confirm a date. He's called my office twice since yesterday morning." Twice since yesterday morning. Tom had been in the ground for less than 24 hours. I drove home along the route I had driven 1,000 times, past the Methodist church and the grain elevator and the little park where I used to take Derek when he was small, and I thought about the man my son had become. I tried, as I had many times, to find the turning point, the moment where something had shifted in him, where the child I remembered had receded and this stranger had taken his place. I never found it. Maybe there wasn't a single moment. Maybe it had been gradual, the way erosion is gradual. Nothing dramatic, just a slow wearing away of something that should have held. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Derek. I let it ring. He called again at noon while I was eating lunch. At 2 in the afternoon, Sandra called from her number, a tactical variation that I found almost interesting in its transparency. At 4, Derek left a voicemail, his tone warmly concerned. He just wanted to check on me, he said, make sure I was doing all right, see if there was anything he could help with. And by the way, had I heard from Gerald yet about scheduling the reading? By the way, I listened to the voicemail twice, deleted it, and called Gerald's office to leave a message. I was prepared to schedule the reading at his earliest convenience, and I would appreciate if he ensured that both Derek and Sandra received formal written notification by mail, as was appropriate. Formal and official, I meant. No casual phone calls, no Derek preparing the ground in advance. That evening, Derek appeared at my front door. He stood on the porch in a fleece jacket looking younger than his 52 years. And when I opened the door, he gave me the look he had given me since he was a teenager. Slightly wounded, slightly aggrieved, as though I had already done something to offend him without his having to specify what. "Mom," he said, "you're not returning my calls. I'm worried about you." I looked at my son. I thought about Tom's letter, sitting in Gerald's file, waiting. "I'm fine, Derek," I said. "I'll see you at the reading." And I closed the door. The reading was held in Gerald's conference room on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after Tom's funeral. I arrived 20 minutes early and sat with a cup of Gerald's secretary's coffee. Weak, slightly burnt, exactly as it had always been in that office. And I let the stillness of the room settle around me. The conference table was long and dark, and the window looked out over a parking lot and a strip of bare November trees. Not a beautiful view, but a real one. Derek and Sandra arrived 3 minutes before the hour. Derek was wearing a suit, which told me something. He had dressed for what he believed was going to be a formal receipt of something due him. Sandra carried a leather folder, as though she had come to take notes. They sat across from me. Derek gave me a nod that managed to be both cordial and proprietary. Sandra arranged her folder on the table. Neither of them spoke to me directly. Gerald came in, settled his papers, thanked everyone for being present, and began. He read the will in full. I watched Derek's face. For the first 4 minutes, Derek's expression was neutral. The face of a man waiting for confirmation of what he expected. Then Gerald reached the section outlining the specific bequests. I watched the neutrality crack. A slight tightening around the jaw. A shift in posture. Sandra's pen, which had been moving across her notepad, stopped. When Gerald read the figure designated for Derek, the fixed finite amount, unremarkable against the estate's full value, Derek's neck went red from the collar up. He said nothing yet. He was controlling himself. Barely. Then Gerald said he had a letter from Thomas Harlow to be read aloud as per instruction. "A letter?" Derek said. "Yes," Gerald said pleasantly, and began to read. Tom's voice, translated through Gerald's measured legal cadence, filled that small room. I had read the letter once with Gerald, but hearing it aloud was something else entirely. Tom had written with the plain directness he brought to everything important. The observations, the pattern, the decision. No malice in the words. No dramatic condemnation. Just a man explaining, with great precision, what he had seen and why it had changed things. When Gerald finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then Derek's composure collapsed. "This is," he began, then stopped, then tried again. "This document is the product of an elderly man who was not thinking clearly at the end of his life. That's obvious. And I intend to challenge it." "That is your legal right," Gerald said calmly. "She had influence over him." Derek's eyes moved to me. She pushed him into this. He would never have done this on his own. I met his gaze and said nothing. My hands were folded on the table. I was very calm in the way that you are calm when you have known something was coming and have had time to prepare for it. Margaret, Gerald said, would you like to respond? No, I said, I wouldn't. Derek stood up. I want it on the record that I believe this will was prepared under duress and undue influence. I'll be retaining my own attorney. Please do, Gerald said, his voice unchanged. You should know, however, that the will was drafted across 2 documented sessions with Thomas present, alone and fully competent, as attested by his physician at that time, a standard precaution for any will revision. The letter was authored in Thomas's own hand and notarized. You are, of course, free to pursue a challenge, but I would encourage you to consult carefully with your attorney before committing to that course. Derek's jaw was tight. Sandra had put her pen down and was watching the table. You did this, Derek said to me. I don't know exactly how, but you did this. I looked at my son across the table. The son I had rocked through earaches and helped with algebra homework and watched graduate from high school on a warm June afternoon while Tom squeezed my hand. I thought about the word finally, said in the back seat of a car on the day of his father's funeral. Tom made his own choices, I said. He always did. You would know that if you'd paid attention. Derek picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. Sandra snapped her leather folder shut. They left without another word. I sat in Gerald's conference room for a few minutes after they were gone, listening to the building settle around me. Gerald poured us both a fresh coffee without asking, and we sat in a not unpleasant silence for a while. How are you feeling? He asked. Like I need a few days, I said. I drove home, changed out of my good blouse, and spent the rest of that day doing very little. I sat in the garden, bare as it was, and drank tea. I watched 2 squirrels conduct what appeared to be a serious disagreement in the oak tree. I called Ruth, and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular. Her grandchildren, a book she was reading, the state of the road by the grocery store. I let myself breathe. That evening, I ran a hot bath, the kind Tom always said I ran too hot, and I stayed in it until the water went lukewarm. And I thought, Derek will retain an attorney. He will make some noise. He will do what people do when they believe the world has failed to deliver them what they were owed. But Tom had been thorough, Gerald had been thorough, and I had barely begun. The call came 8 days later on a Sunday morning. Derek's voice on the phone was different than it had been in Gerald's conference room. Softer, careful. The voice of someone who had spent a week recalibrating. Mom, he said, I've been thinking a lot this week. I know things got heated at Gerald's. I want to apologize for that. I was in the kitchen making oatmeal. I turned the heat down slightly and stood very still. I hear you, I said. I was in shock, he continued. Dad's death, then all of that at once? I didn't handle it well. Sandra and I have been talking, and we'd really like to sit down with you. Not in a lawyer's office, just family. We thought maybe we could come over Thursday for lunch, just the 3 of us, and talk everything through like adults. I thought about the leather folder Sandra had brought to the reading. I thought about Derek checking his watch during Tom's eulogy. I thought about the word finally. That's all right, Derek, I said. I don't think there's much to talk about. A pause. The recalibration. Mom, I understand the will says what it says, but we're family. Surely we can come to our own arrangement, something that works for everyone, without dragging this through courts for the next 2 years. There it was, the arrangement. The offer made to sound like generosity that was actually an attempt to get me to voluntarily surrender what Tom had legally and explicitly given me. I appreciate the thought, I said pleasantly, but I'm comfortable with Tom's decisions. Another pause, longer. Okay, Derek said. His voice had gone flat. I just want you to think about what kind of relationship we'll have going forward. That's all I'm saying. I said goodbye and hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, then went back to my oatmeal. A threat dressed as a concern. What kind of relationship would we have? The implication that my willingness to be robbed was the condition of having a son. It was not the first time someone had tried that trade with me, and it was not going to work any better now. That afternoon, I called Ruth. Ruth Kaplan had lived next door to us for 22 years. She had brought me casseroles when I had a bad bout of pneumonia in 2019. She had been at our anniversary parties, had weathered her own widowhood 7 years ago, and had the particular forthrightness of a woman who had long since stopped managing other people's feelings at the expense of her own clarity. She was, in short, exactly the person I needed. I told her everything: the funeral, the word finally, Gerald's office, the Sunday phone call. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was a discipline she had developed specifically for conversations with me, knowing that I needed to say things in order before I could be ready to hear responses. "Well," she said when I finished, "he hasn't changed since he was 12, has he?" Despite everything, I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had since Tom died, and it felt strange and necessary at the same time. "No," I said, "he really hasn't." Ruth had known Derek since he was a teenager. She had watched, over the years, the particular dynamics of our family with the observational advantage of someone who lived close but not inside it. Her perspective, offered with her characteristic lack of ceremony, was both validating and clarifying. "You need a good estate litigator," she said. "Not just Gerald, who's wonderful, but someone who specifically handles will contests. Derek said he's retaining an attorney. You should have someone in your corner who does nothing else." She was right. I knew she was right. Gerald was our family attorney and a good one, but this was moving into specialized territory. I spent the following 2 days making inquiries, asking Gerald himself for a recommendation, calling the local bar association, and ultimately speaking to a woman named Patricia Elaine Foss, who came highly recommended and who, when I described my situation in a 40-minute phone call, said with a directness I immediately respected, "This is a straightforward case in your favor. Let me tell you why." Patricia was 58, brisk, precise, with the kind of confidence that comes not from ego, but from long experience with exactly this type of dispute. She had handled over 100 contested will cases. She knew what Derek's attorney would argue. She knew what the procedural timeline looked like, and she knew, and showed me the documentation to support this, that a will contested on grounds of undue influence required the contesting party to provide evidence of that influence, not merely assert it. Tom's physician had confirmed his competence at the time of drafting. Gerald had witnessed and documented everything properly. The letter was handwritten and notarized. Derek had nothing. Patricia and I met at her office on a Wednesday afternoon, and by the time I left, I felt something that had been absent for weeks, a sense of stable ground. I did not know what Derek would try next, but I knew who I was, and I knew what Tom had intended, and I knew I had people beside me now, Ruth, Gerald, Patricia, who were not going to let me stand alone in this. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. They appeared on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks after the phone call, without notice. I was in the kitchen when I heard the knock. Not Derek's usual perfunctory 2 raps, but a slower, gentler knock that immediately put me on alert. The consciously gentle knock of someone who had rehearsed their entrance. I dried my hands and went to the door. Derek stood on the porch with Sandra beside him. He was in his weekend clothes, a soft flannel shirt, no jacket, which I understood was a costuming choice. Sandra had brought a baked good in a dish I recognized as her mother's ceramic pie plate, a domestic prop of the first order. She was dressed in a way that managed to be both casual and deliberate. "We were in the area," Derek said, "and we just wanted to stop by. We weren't sure you'd answer if we called." Accurate, I thought. "Come in," I said. I let them in because closing the door on them again would have been satisfying, but not strategic. I needed to see what they had come to say. I put the kettle on, more as a reason to have my back to them momentarily than because anyone wanted tea. And I listened to them settle into the sitting room. Sandra had placed the pie dish on my kitchen counter and was now sitting in the armchair. Tom's armchair, I noticed, which may have been an accident and may not have been. Derek was on the sofa. He had the look of a man who had prepared remarks. I brought the tea in, sat down in my usual chair, and waited. Derek began with the family history. His childhood memories, offered as affection, though I noticed they were strategically selected. The beach trip in 1987, the Christmas when he got the bicycle, the afternoon Tom helped him fix his first car. Memories that positioned him as a beloved child who had been deprived, by implication, of something he was owed by that very love. Then Sandra spoke, which told me they had divided the work between them. Her angle was softer, more indirect. She talked about how hard the past weeks had been, how much she and Derek wanted to maintain a relationship with me, how family was the only thing that mattered in the end. Her voice was warm in the practiced way that professional warmth is warm. It had the shape of sincerity without the substance. "We're not asking for anything unreasonable," Sandra said. "We're just asking you to think about what Dad would have wanted, for the family to be whole." I looked at her. "Tom made a will," I said. "I think that's a fairly clear statement of what Tom wanted." Derek's expression shifted. The rehearsed warmth dropped a register. "Mom," he said, "we're not asking you to go against the will. We're asking you, we're asking you, as your son, to consider a private arrangement, a conversation, something that doesn't have to go through courts and attorneys and all of that. An arrangement meaning you receive more than Tom allocated," I said. Derek pressed forward. "Meaning we reach something equitable, something that reflects the spirit of a family, rather than a legal document drawn up by an old man who wasn't—" He stopped himself. "Wasn't what?" I said. The room was quiet. Sandra looked at the wall. Derek reset his expression. "This will destroy us," he said. "You know that. If this goes to court, if we spend the next year fighting over it, you and I will never have a relationship again. Is that what you want? Is that what you want from your final years, Mom? To be at war with your own son?" There it was. The final card? The threat packaged as a warning, the violence dressed as concern. Your final years. A reminder of age and isolation, of the loneliness that awaited me if I failed to comply. I sat in my chair and I looked at my son. Really looked at him, the 52-year-old man who had once fit entirely in the crook of my arm. And I thought of Tom sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded and his careful, certain voice. "I've been watching him too. Derek," I said, "your father made his decision clearly and with full capacity, and he wrote down his reasons in his own handwriting. I'm not going to override that. I'm not able to, and I wouldn't if I were. Now, I've enjoyed the visit, but I think we've reached the end of what there is to say today." I stood up. Sandra stood with the automatic response of someone who had learned to exit gracefully. Derek stood more slowly. His face had closed off entirely. No more performance, no more warmth, just a hard blankness that I had seen on him before, in childhood, when he had been told no and had not yet decided what to do about it. "You're going to regret this," he said. Not a question, a statement. "Perhaps," I said, and opened the front door. They walked out. I closed the door behind them. I heard their car start. I stood in my front hallway for a long moment in the sudden silence. Was I afraid? Yes. A little. In the way that you are afraid when you have held a line and you know the person on the other side has not given up, has only withdrawn to recalculate. Derek had threatened me with isolation and with legal war, and neither of those threats was hollow. A contested will was expensive and slow and draining. A son who cut off all contact was a particular kind of grief that didn't announce itself clearly at first. But the fear had an edge to it that was different from the fear I had felt in those first days after Tom died. This fear was clean. It had a shape. And a strange thing happens when fear has a shape. You can work with it. You can plan around it. You can use it as fuel. I went back to the kitchen and picked up my phone. I texted Patricia. They came in person today. I'll give you the details on Monday. All well. Her reply came quickly. Good. Stay the course. Talk Monday. I made dinner. I ate it. I washed the dishes. Outside, the November dark had settled in early, and the street was quiet, and the house was mine. Derek filed the formal challenge in December. Patricia had expected it. She had told me to expect it. She had also told me, with the measured confidence I had come to rely on, that a filed challenge was not the same thing as a viable one. He has the right to file, she said. He does not have the right to win. The hearing was scheduled for mid-February, 2.5 months away. I spent those months quietly. I did not contact Derek. I answered Gerald's and Patricia's questions, provided documentation when requested, and otherwise lived my life. Coffee with Ruth, the church book club that Tom had always gently teased me about, grocery shopping, long walks in the cold Ohio mornings. I was learning, in those months, the particular discipline of waiting without falling apart. Tom had been good at that. I was getting better. Patricia and I prepared carefully. She was precise and thorough in the way of someone who had litigated enough contested wills to know that preparation was where these cases were won or lost, not in the drama of the courtroom moment. We went through every document. We reviewed the physician's competency attestation, the notarized letter, Gerald's records of both drafting sessions. We anticipated Derek's arguments and built responses to each one. The central argument Derek's attorney intended to make was undue influence, that I had somehow manipulated Tom in his final years of declining health into revising his will in my favor and against his son's. It was a legal theory that looked plausible from the outside. Elderly man, health issues, devoted spouse, estranged son. But that collapsed immediately on contact with facts. Tom had gone to Gerald's office alone. His physician had documented his competency at the time. The changes had been made 18 months before Tom's death, not in the final weeks or days when a picture of mental decline might have been painted. Derek had nothing except his assertion. And assertions, Patricia observed, do not meet the evidentiary standard. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in mid-February. The courtroom was not dramatic. A small county probate courtroom, fluorescent lighting, wooden benches, the particular institutional quiet of government buildings. Patricia sat beside me. Gerald was there as a witness. Across the room, Derek and Sandra sat with their attorney, a man named Vogel, who had the practiced energy of someone accustomed to manufacturing grievance from thin material. Vogel's opening was skillful in its way. He painted a picture of an isolated son, a controlling mother, an elderly father who had become, in his declining years, dependent on his wife in ways that made him susceptible. He used words like influence and isolation and diminished capacity with the smooth repetition of someone who understood that in law, as in advertising, saying something often enough has its own persuasive force. Patricia's cross-examination of Derek took 40 minutes. I had been in enough difficult conversations in my 71 years to recognize the moment when a person's story begins to unravel. Not all at once, but thread by thread, each pulled answer loosening the next. Patricia did not shout. She did not perform. She asked Derek, in a pleasant and unhurried voice, to describe the specific instances in which he had witnessed me exerting undue pressure on his father. She asked him to name the occasions on which he had expressed concern about his father's mental state to anyone: a physician, a friend, a family member, prior to Tom's death. She asked him when, precisely, he had become aware that his father's will had been updated. The answers came slowly and poorly. No specific instances, no documented concerns. Awareness, he admitted under pressure, that had come from a comment Tom had made. Tom had mentioned, in the last year of his life, that he had taken care of things. Derek had interpreted this as reassurance. He had not asked further. "So to be clear," Patricia said, "your father told you he had handled his affairs. You chose not to inquire further, and you are now claiming that the affairs he handled reflect someone else's influence rather than his own intentions." Derek's attorney objected. The objection was noted and overruled. Then Patricia asked the court's permission to enter Tom's letter into the record. The letter was read aloud by the court clerk. Tom's words, plain and exact, in the formal silence of a courtroom in February. I listened to them and stared at the table in front of me and kept my hands still. When the reading concluded, I looked up. Derek's face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession, something I had never seen from him before. He was not a man who easily lost his composure. But hearing his own father's assessment of him, spoken in a courtroom by a stranger's voice, in the presence of a judge and opposing counsel and his own attorney, that, apparently, was different. A man can dismiss a document in an attorney's conference room. He cannot dismiss it from a public record. "He didn't mean," Derek began, turning slightly toward his attorney, then stopping. "Your client will wait to be addressed," the judge said. Derek sat back. His face had gone still in a way that was worse than anger, a rigid, closed stillness that I recognized as the last position before complete loss of control. Sandra put a hand on his arm. He didn't look at her. When Patricia finished her arguments, Vogel's response had the quality of a structure that has been undermined at the foundation. Formally upright, visibly unsound. There was nothing to rebut because Derek had failed to produce what the law required him to produce. Assertions without evidence. A narrative without documentation. A son who had never, until after the funeral, expressed to anyone a single concern about his father's competency or his mother's behavior. The judge reviewed the documentation. The hearing adjourned. The ruling was expected within 10 business days. I walked out of that courtroom into a cold February afternoon, and Patricia walked beside me and she said, "You'll hear by end of next week, but I don't want you to wait anxiously. You already know what the answer is." I did know. I had known since I read Tom's letter in Gerald's office and understood what my husband had built for me, carefully and quietly, in the last years of his life. I thanked Patricia and drove home through the gray Ohio afternoon, and I thought, "Almost done, Tom. Almost." The ruling came in 9 days. Patricia called me on a Wednesday morning while I was in the garden, despite the cold, pulling up the last of the dead perennials from the border bed along the fence. Tom had always done that job. I was learning it late. "Margaret," Patricia said, "the challenge has been dismissed." I straightened up slowly from where I was crouching by the fence. "In full?" I said. "Completely," she said. "The court found no evidence sufficient to support a claim of undue influence. The will stands exactly as written. The estate is yours." I stood in the cold garden holding a trowel and I said, "Thank you, Patricia, for everything." "Tom did the work," she said. "I just presented it. It was the right thing to say. I appreciated it more than I told her." The legal implications unfolded over the following weeks with the procedural efficiency of a matter that had been clearly decided. The estate was formally administered. The accounts, the house, the investments, all confirmed in my name, as Tom had arranged. The modest bequest to Derek was also confirmed, as written, to be disbursed regardless of the failed challenge. Tom had written no spite into his arrangements. Even in the bequest itself, he had been decent. Derek's attorney, I later learned from a brief note Gerald sent me, had sent a letter acknowledging the ruling and indicating that his client would not be pursuing further legal action. There it was, the formal acknowledgement that it was over. I read it twice and filed it away in the same leather folder where Tom had kept his "if something happens" documents. The financial and legal cost of Derek's challenge was his to bear. Attorney's fees, court costs, the time and disruption of the process. None of that was my burden. Patricia billed me for her work, which was entirely fair and which I paid without discomfort, because it was money spent protecting what Tom had worked 46 years to build and had chosen to leave in my hands. What about Derek? Derek did not contact me after the ruling. Not immediately. In the weeks that followed, there was silence from Columbus. Complete and, I was surprised to discover, not entirely unwelcome. I had spent a great deal of my life in the particular low-grade tension of managing a son who never quite arrived at warmth, and the silence, though it was the silence of rupture rather than peace, had a quality of cleanness to it. I spoke to Gerald about it one afternoon when I stopped by his office to sign the final estate documents. "Is it unusual," I asked him, "to feel relieved?" Gerald, who had seen a great deal of human behavior in 40 years of practice, considered this carefully. "In cases like this one," he said, "I think it's probably the most honest response available." I thought about that. I had not wanted this. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I had not wanted a contested will and a court hearing and a son who stood across a conference room and said she did this. I had wanted what most people want, which is an ordinary life with ordinary grief. To lose Tom and mourn him and carry on with the people I loved still near. I had not chosen any of the machinery of this. But here is what I knew, standing on the other side of it. Tom had seen clearly. Tom had loved me with the clearest eyes of anyone I had ever been close to, and he had done what he could to protect me from something I hadn't fully admitted I needed protection from, and I had stood in the space that created and held the line he had drawn. That was not a defeat. That was not even primarily a victory, though it was that too. It was more than anything a completion, the last thing Tom did for me, and the last thing I could do in return. To honor it by not giving it away. I signed the documents. Gerald walked me to the door. Outside, it was early March, and the first suggestions of something other than gray were beginning to show in the sky. Not spring yet, not warm, but a lightening of the light that was at least the promise of it. I drove home along the same route I had always driven, past the Methodist church, past the grain elevator, past the little park. I was 71 years old, and the house was mine, and Tom had loved me, and it was enough. Spring came late that year, as it often does in Ohio, but when it came decisively. By April, the garden was asking for attention, and I gave it. I spent whole mornings outside with my gloves and my trowel and the radio playing through the kitchen window, and I found, to my mild surprise, that I was good at it. Tom had always been the gardener, but there was a particular satisfaction in doing it myself, in the physical directness of putting something in the ground and knowing it might grow. Ruth came over 2 or 3 mornings a week, and we drank coffee on the back porch and talked the way women in their 70s talk when they've earned the right to say exactly what they mean. She had started a small reading group in the neighborhood, and I joined it. And I found myself looking forward to Thursdays with a pleasure that felt uncomplicated and real. In May, I took a trip, my first in several years. I drove to Vermont with Ruth, 3 weeks through the kind of country that rewards looking at slowly. We stayed at inns, ate well, and spent long evenings on different porches, talking about the books we were reading and the years we had lived. It was exactly the life I was supposed to be having. I gave Tom's established charities a substantial donation in his name. The hospice organization, the local library endowment, the scholarship fund at the technical college where he had taken a welding class in his 40s simply because he wanted to know how. It felt like the right continuation of what Tom had started. I am not going to pretend that I never thought about Derek. He was my son. That doesn't stop being true because the person in question has disappointed you past a certain threshold. I thought about him sometimes at night, or when I drove past the park. I kept those thoughts when they arrived and let them go when they were ready. What I heard about Derek came through the indirect channels of small to medium Ohio life. A mutual acquaintance, a comment from Gerald, a mention from Ruth who had heard something from her daughter. The legal challenge had been expensive. Derek's attorney had not worked cheaply, and the full court process had cost Derek significantly more than he had anticipated. When the gamble failed, the costs remained. There had also been friction at the firm where Derek worked, commercial real estate brokerage, related to his distraction during the months of the legal process. The kind of friction that narrows future options quietly. Sandra had not found the experience strengthening. She had believed there was a certain financial future attached to the Harlow name. The revelation that it was considerably more modest than she had planned produced the kind of reassessment that neither party in a marriage enjoys. By autumn, they were living separately. I was not glad about this. Whatever was happening between them was its own private unhappiness, and unhappiness does not become less real for being deserved. I had no energy left for anything other than my own life. And my own life was good. The garden in summer was better than I expected. The Vermont trip became an annual plan. Thursdays with the reading group became one of the fixed pleasures of my week. I had lunch with Gerald and his wife in August, and we told stories about Tom for 2 hours, and I laughed more than I cried. I had money enough to live well. I had the house and the garden and Ruth. I had Tom's letter in the desk drawer. Not a source of grief anymore, but of something quieter. The knowledge that someone had seen me clearly and loved me specifically, and had done what love at its best does. Taken care. What more, at 71, in the clear Ohio light, do you need? I thought about that for a while, and found I did not have a very long answer. So that is the story, all of it. Tom saw clearly because he paid attention. He built something quiet and solid, and it held. That is what love does when it is patient and honest. I held the line because I owed it to him and to myself. There is a version of this story where fear of loneliness wins, where I trade what I was given for a peace that was never going to be real. I chose differently. And that is the thing I'm most at peace with. So I'll ask you directly, what would you have done, sitting across from your own child, hearing that your compliance was the price of his company? Think about it. I'd genuinely like to know your answer. Leave it in the comments below. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe. It means more than you know. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.